We always hear that history is the story of the past. But what happens when most of the characters have been totally written out of the script? Today, we're diving into a massive challenge for historians. How in the world do you reconstruct the lives of people who were left out of the official records? So just think about it for a second. When you crack open a history book, whose story are you expecting to find? A king, maybe a president, a famous general? This question right here gets to the absolute core of what we're talking about today. For a long, long time, history has really focused on the documented lives, right? The kings, the politicians, the wealthy. But what about, well, everyone else? The farmers, the laborers, the enslaved people. This laser focus on the powerful has created a kind of historical amnesia, where we've basically forgotten the stories of the vast majority of humanity. All right, so first up, let's really break down this whole problem of these missing stories. Now, this idea of historical amnesia, it isn't just about passively forgetting things over time. It's much more active than that. It's about a systemic pattern of omission, a decision, whether conscious or not, that certain lives were just not important enough to write down. And this is so important. The gaps you see in the historical archive, they are not accidents. They were often created on purpose, through exclusion, through suppression, and just by the simple fact that the people in power controlled who and what got recorded for posterity. So, if these gaps weren't accidents, then what caused them? In this next part, we're going to explore what some historians call the archive of absence to figure out exactly why these stories went missing in the first place. I mean, there are some very real practical reasons for this. For so many people throughout history, writing down their own story was an impossible luxury. They often had little to no education, couldn't afford something as simple as paper. And even when records were made, the official institutions just didn't think they were important enough to save. But okay, here's where it gets even trickier. There's a second problem. What happens when we do find a mention of a marginalized person? Well, that source is almost never neutral. It's pretty much always filtered through the perspective of someone with power. So for example, a plantation owner might write in his diary, "My servant, John, is rebellious and requires constant discipline." We get a name, John, but the description is completely shaped by the owner's worldview. The word rebellious is the owner's interpretation, not John's reality. Exactly. What was John actually fighting for? What did he believe? Who did he love? The diary doesn't tell us any of that. The source is contaminated by the author's power and their prejudice. And this is the central puzzle that historians are trying to solve. So how do we solve this puzzle? Well, this brings us to the most innovative and, frankly, the coolest part of our story, the new toolkit historians are using to overcome these huge obstacles. The big idea here is that historians have to stop thinking like librarians and start acting more like archaeologists. They can't just read the documents that are handed to them. They have to dig through these tiny, fragmented pieces of evidence and painstakingly reconstruct a life from the little clues that were left behind. And here is that toolkit in action. It really comes down to 4 key strategies. First, reading documents critically to find the hidden meanings. Second, digging into community history, things like folklore and songs. Third, conducting oral history by actually talking to descendants. And finally, using tools from other fields like sociology and anthropology to find more clues. Let's take a closer look at a couple of these. First up is this technique called reading against the grain. What this really means is you don't take a document like a court record or a will at face value. You have to question it. Why was this written? Who was it for? And maybe, most importantly, what is it not saying? It's about finding the real story in the silences. Next, historians are looking way beyond the official archives. They're turning to community histories. And this stuff is absolutely fascinating. They're looking at folklore, at songs, at everyday objects, at family trees. They've realized that a community's collective memory often holds clues that were never written down by anyone in power. And to make sense of all this, they use some really powerful theoretical tools like intersectionality. This is this crucial idea that you can't understand a person's life by just looking at one thing. For instance, the experience of a poor Black woman isn't just about being poor or being Black or being a woman. It's about how all those identities intersect and overlap to create a completely unique reality. So let's bring this all together in our final section and ask the big question. Why does all of this painstaking work matter so much anyway? Well, doing this kind of work comes with a huge amount of responsibility. It forces historians to ask a really difficult, really important ethical question. How do you tell a story that isn't yours to tell? That question hangs over every single person who tries to reconstruct one of these unwritten lives. See, it's not just about research skills. It's about being deeply self-aware. Historians have to acknowledge their own biases, they have to respect people's privacy, and they have to avoid those simplistic, feel-good stories that erase the very real struggles a community faced. This work requires a deep sense of respect and sensitivity. Because ultimately, uncovering these stories is so much more than just filling in a few gaps in a textbook. It is an act of historical justice. It's about correcting the record, it's about challenging that old idea that only the powerful matter, and it's about creating a more honest, more inclusive picture of our shared past. In the end, what it all comes down to is this. Reconstructing these lives is absolutely crucial if we want to have a more equitable and complete understanding of how our society works. By telling these stories, we get a fuller, fairer, and just a more truthful picture of how we all got here. And that leaves us with one final thought for you to take with you. Who are the forgotten people in your own community, in your own town? Whose stories are just sitting there waiting to be told? Because this work doesn't just happen in archives and universities. It starts with all of us getting curious about the unwritten lives that are all around us.